As you're all aware, it's that time of year again, where things are spooky, creepy, and just a little bit cringy. So in spirit of this month of Spooktober, I bring you, attention all shoppers. I'm going to post this here for one reason, and one reason only, because I am not a bad person. Yes, I had a few issues with my family members growing up, nothing traumatic. And I've taken my fair share of teasing and bullying in high school, but there's absolutely nothing mentally wrong with me, other than I have had enough. I know the media nowadays likes to take stories like mine and try to find some sort of illness or something to blame. But rest assured, all my eggs are in the right basket, whether you agree with me or not. Let me explain a little bit better. My name? Don't worry about it. Where do I live? Don't worry about that either. The only details I will give you about myself are the following. I work in a retail store that I'm 99% sure all of you have heard of, been to, and at least shopped in once in your lives. I've worked there for several years now, having held various positions from cashier to backroom to shelf stocking to my most recent position, the customer service desk. And up until very recently, I would have never dreamed of harming another person. I was raised to be well-mannered, sensitive, sympathetic, empathetic, caring, and helpful, and I continue to be most of the time. Multiple years in retail has given me the incredible skill of bottling up my emotions and hiding them super well. I can be boiling angry on the inside and still smiling and remaining cool as a cucumber on the outside. That said, it'd probably be good to give you a little info on what exactly I do where I work. At the service desk where I work, we handle returns and refunds, process money transfers, cash checks, and sell and print money orders for customers. Sounds easy, right? Well, while the tasks themselves are not complicated in the slightest, the stupidity and attitudes of the customer make it quite challenging sometimes. Now, do you remember the golden rule? From preschool. If not, the golden rule simply says, treat others the way you would like to be treated. Sounds fair, right? Well, maybe it's due to my upbringing in a mostly loving family combined with my strong desire as a child and even still in adulthood to make people happy. But I have always lived as if this wasn't just a rule. To me, it was always the golden law. The north of my moral compass, if you will. And here, I believe, I can begin my story. Almost every Friday since I've been employed at the store, a particular woman has come in with whom I've had many, many issues. I believe the first time I had the misfortune of meeting her, she threw her DVD case at me because I, as the store policy and my manager dictated, refused her return of an open copy of Old Yeller. The only reason I remember this is because I was thinking to myself what a coincidence it was that an older lady was yelling at me about a movie called Old Yeller. I know, I'm corny. Whatever. Anyway, she insists she wanted to return it because she'd never watch it again because it was too sappy for her. Fair enough, but not permitted at our store. I smiled sympathetically and said, I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do. If you really want to get your money back for it, I suggest you trying to sell it on eBay or something. It's easy and you may end up getting more than you paid for it here. She snorted indignantly and told my manager that I was just trying to shut her up and get her to leave. To which my manager did nothing but reprimand me, but still, the nerve of this lady. I was just trying to help. Since then, she's been nothing but nasty to me. One time when I wasn't looking, she stole my pen that I got while I was at my favorite vacation spot. Another time, she yelled at me in front of a whole line of customers because I was going too slow. And if I can't do my job quick enough, I shouldn't be working here. To which everyone in line behind her agreed, making me feel so humiliated and angry inside. You have to understand. To this day, our registers are just not that fast. They're old, outdated, and corporate refuses to upgrade. I can only work with what I got, and I can only go as fast as my register can. I'm human. I mentioned that I've been working there several years now. Though, and as they've gone by, they've only made me more belligerent, rude, and ignorant. She was already over the hill in the early years of my career there, and over the last few years, she's been allegedly developing some medical issues, which, if you ask me, are bullshit. I honestly think she's looking for attention because nowadays she'll come into the store with no cane, no limp, and virtually no signs of physical decline whatsoever. But then she'll take one of the electric scooter carts that our store has as a courtesy to those who are really disabled. I'm not even lying. This hag once told a young lady who had only one leg that she'd have to wait if she wanted to use it because I got here first. I know. What kind of raging lunatic. So now that I've painted you a hopefully sufficient picture of how horrible this woman is to me, and to many other associates with whom I share retail sales, Let me digress again to explain to you another key piece of information. I mentioned earlier that I had some issues with people in my family while I was growing up. However, this does not include my grandmother. She and I were incredibly close ever since I can remember, and I loved her more than just about anybody else in the world, with the exception of maybe my parents. Sadly, about 3 years ago, she was diagnosed with cancer and was given about 6 months to live. Fortunately for me, my grandmother was one of the most stubborn people to ever walk this earth, and walked out of that doctor's office and didn't come back for almost 2 years. After that, her health really took a turn for the worse, and I tried to spend as much time as possible with her because any second could be her last, and I needed to be there for her. Of course, however, I still had bills to pay, college was expensive, car insurance and gas were expensive, and I had a maxed out credit card with a boatload of money due in minimum payments every month. So while I was at work, another family member would go up to Grandma's house to keep an eye on her and tend to her every need, with specific instructions to call my cell if anything were to give them reason to believe that her end was coming. One night, the night that stains my memory like red wine on white carpet, I was working from 1 p.m. until 10 p.m. It was a Friday, around 6, and as usual, this rude hag I described earlier walked in and sat her ass down right on one of the electric scooters. As always, she parked it in front of my register at the service desk and stood up, demanding that I, for the umpteenth time, process a money transfer for her to send $500 to her daughter in Florida. I was just in the middle of counting the monster lady's money when I heard my phone ring loudly in my pocket. I panicked and fully shifted my focus from this miserable old bat to my phone, hoping that it wasn't bad news about my grandma. I dropped her money on the counter and whipped out my phone. I looked at the caller ID to recognize the number was my aunt's, who was currently looking after my grandma. I instantly pressed answer and my mouth went dry as cotton. I'll never forget how much my legs were shaking, how my stomach dropped as I put the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I asked, waiting for the worst news of my life. "Honey, I'm so sorry. It happened so fast." That was all I heard my aunt say before I flipped it closed. I heard a loud ringing noise in my ears. My mouth was as dry as a desert floor, and I began to feel my face turn bright red as it began to feel 100 or more degrees hotter than usual. At last, the tears. The tears poured down my cheeks like summer rain, and my legs, quaking like a shifting fault line, finally gave out. Right there behind the service desk of the store, I began to cry like a baby. It had finally happened. I remember to this day how I used to lay awake at night as a 5 or 6 year old, terrified that my grandma was going to die someday, and now she had finally gone. It was the worst nightmare I could never wake up from, and I realized that my life would never be the same again. Naturally, the girl I was working with at the register next to me knew exactly why I was crying. I was very open with my coworkers about how much I loved and cared about my grandma, and they were all on edge, praying for her health and for my mental strength during these rough times. She didn't even have to ask me. She just placed her hand on my shoulder, gently rubbed my back, and that's when I heard it. Excuse me, I'm still waiting here. What in the hell is this little jerk's problem? I've got a lot to do tonight." If I have to tell you who it is that said this, you haven't been paying attention. Instantly, tears stopped coming out of my eyes. I swallowed every drop of sadness and forced myself to stand up. Everything, and I mean everything, from the ceiling to the floor to the register buttons, to the merchandise sitting on the shelves down the aisle across from the service desk, suddenly had a red tint to it. Standing face to face with this hag, I stretched my sleeves down past my wrists, dried my eyes, and choked out, "Nothing. I'm fine. I apologize." That was all I could spit up. One more word and I would have lost it. But I knew I had to finish this transaction. Would you like to know something funny? When you come to a store like the one I work at, where you can send money to other countries and states, or cash a paycheck, or even return an item without a receipt, usually you're required to show some form of identification. While this thoughtless, ungrateful, unsympathetic, arrogant, ignorant, self-important, unbelievable hag was standing at my register, proverbially kicking me while I was more down than I've ever been in my life. After years and years of tormenting me over stupid, petty bullshit, there, propped up facing me in between a small crack in the lid of the receipt paper printer, sat this hag's driver's license. I cracked. I admit it. But you know what? I don't regret what I did. Not in the least. I had the procedure for transferring money memorized to the point where I didn't even have to look at the screen to know what I was doing. So while my fingers did the work, my eyes burned the image of this lady's name and address, which I'm not going to share and incriminate myself, into my memory bank. After I was certain that I'd given myself enough time to remember the necessary information, under the guise that my register was being slow, I finally gave the unsuspecting old hag her ID back, printed the receipt, collected her signature at the bottom, and told her to have a very nice night, and apologized again for the inconvenience my register and emotions had caused her. There was no way in hell I was going to give her an actual excuse to get me in trouble at my job. At that point, one tiny negative comment towards her might have given anyone within earshot a reason to suspect me of committing the atrocious crimes that I was secretly plotting. Once she had left, I removed my worker's vest, threw on my jacket, and clocked out, sputtering, "I have to go. Grandma," as I passed my manager on the walk out the door. I had driven to my grandma's house every single Sunday and sometimes other days during the week, too, for the last 6 years. Usually, I would stop off at the food store and pick us up some carrot cake for dessert or pull into the flower shop parking lot and get her a dozen roses just to make her smile. This time, however, it felt like I was driving an entire world away. Every car that I got stuck behind seemed to be going 50 miles per hour too slow. Every red light I had stopped at seemed to be 10 times longer than they normally did. And when I finally arrived and parked outside her house, it seemed like a complete stranger's house. The house that I'd come to feel more at home at than even my own house growing up now felt so sorrowful, depressing, and cold. I ascended the front porch steps and opened the front door, and shoved aside any family members who were already there and trying to console me, and brace me for the impact of the sight of a cold, shriveled corpse of a woman who was not only my grandmother, but my very best friend in the entire world. I walked into her bedroom, saw her lying there under her blankets, limply snuggling the stuffed dog that resembled her old puppy Bella, and immediately broke down. I felt like I had failed her by not being there. I felt like I betrayed her, and I promised myself that I would never forgive myself for not being able to say goodbye. I should have done more. I don't know exactly what I could have done, but I could have figured something out somehow that would allow me to be there the moment she decided that her cancer was finally too much to bear. I know that if it's her choice, she would have waited to see me too, but it was my responsibility to be there for her, not the other way around. The funeral was beautiful. I've never seen so many people in one small room, and I've never seen so many people crying in the same room. She touched so many lives in so many ways. That night, my family and I had a party in her honor that consisted of 3 cases of beer and a pyramid of empty cans that reached to the chandelier hanging above the kitchen table. We told stories and shared memories of her and did the best we could to help each other get through this terrible, terrible tragedy. But something was still nagging at me in the back of my mind. That hag. The way she had disrespected me that night my grandma passed away was unforgivable. It was the very, very last straw. She needed to be taught a lesson, and at the funeral I vowed in a prayer while kneeling before my grandma's urn that rude, selfish monster would regret the day that she had ever been rude to me. So I began planning, and one night I went shopping for the equipment I needed to bring my swift, iron-fisted justice. I bought a few feet of rope and a bucket from one store, a collapsible folding chair from another, a baseball bat from another, and some razor wire from another. When I was sure enough time had passed to take any suspicion off myself, using some latex gloves and a lockpick fashioned out of a paperclip, I snuck into that hag's house in the dead of the night. The house was old and empty, and as I prowled around her cozy homestead hallways, random floorboards would creak and moan. It was so dark, but I was confident and careful. After hearing an intruder ascend the staircase, she came out into the hallway threatening to call the police if whoever it was didn't leave immediately. No way in hell. I bolted towards the sound of her voice, bat in hand, and cracked her a good one right in the skull. I can still hear the thud her body made as she crashed cold onto the floor. She awoke to me pouring a bucket of cold water onto her in her basement. I had gagged her with a pair of her own socks and used the rope to tie her to the folding chair. She began panicking, surely wondering what's going on, who would do this to her, what did they want, and what was going to be the end. Her mind must have been racing a mile a minute trying to figure out exactly who it was that she had wronged so badly that they would do something so horrible to her. But believe me, as long as I let her sit there dark, terrified, and confused, contemplating and wondering, I never once came into her mind. I could tell when I finally turned on the light to reveal myself to her by the look in her eyes, the look of shock, and then regret, and then disgust. Even as my captive, she still looked at me as a piece of vermin, a cockroach that needed to be squished. She never once imagined that I, a piece of a store, register, machinery, rather than human, would ever be capable of finding her and punishing her. "Hello, hag," I sneered. "Do you remember me? Do you recognize me? Sure you do." She began wiggling in the chair, trying to break free, desperate to get the sock out of her mouth so she could doubtlessly spew more filth from that facial shithole. "I've come here tonight pretty much at your own invitation," I said. "You see, you've come into my store on a weekly basis for years and treated me, my coworkers, and our other customers as if we owed you something, as if you are God's gift to the goddamn world. As you know, I've processed many money transfers to your daughter in Florida over the last few years, and you foolishly handed over all the necessary information that I needed to make your life absolutely miserable while you were doing it. You gave me your driver's license with your address on it, which led me right to you. Don't you think it's sad that I showed up here, knowing that you're such an ass that I wouldn't have any trouble having to fight a husband or boyfriend? You're just a miserable old hag who preys on the kind and polite because you know we can't say anything back or else we'll get in trouble with our managers. All we do is try to help you and do our jobs, but you just always have to find something to bitch about. Honestly, at this point, it was as if I was speaking to a deaf woman. Clearly, the severity of the situation was not sinking in. So I decided to just get right to the point. Why draw it out any longer than I needed to? Do you love your daughter? I asked, scratching my head in a tone that revealed that I was completely in control of the situation. Her eyes shot open wide as if to ask, "What do you care?" Well, I explained, reaching into my pocket. More likely you do. I can't even begin to fathom how you managed to trick some poor man into having sex with you. I can only hope it was through the use of some form of date rape drug. But your daughter? She's probably the only person in the world you've ever treated like an actual human being, isn't she? Someone you used to read bedtime stories to, and sing lullabies to, and take shopping during Girls' Day Out, as you paraded through town treating store clerk after store clerk like me more and more like shit as the day went on. At last, I saw a tiny bit of reflection in her eyes as she began reliving tiny moments of her past with her daughter in this highly tense, unpredictable situation she was stuck in. I imagine your daughter is nowhere near as rude to other people as you are, I said. She's probably beautiful and married with kids of her own. Maybe that's why you're so bitter. I carefully pulled the sharp razor wire out of my pocket and slowly approached her, letting it rest, dangling around her neck past her shoulders. She squirmed and began to panic even more, desperately trying to wiggle free, to no avail. It's a shame that you couldn't have realized that people like me were not going to take people like your shit anymore. If you had, perhaps you might have saved your poor, beautiful daughter's life. From deep behind the sock jammed in her mouth, I heard an enraged and confused screech that was most certainly the word. What? You heard me right. Your daughter is dead. So are her kids. So is her husband. And it's all your fault. You led me right to them. Wait. Oh yeah, I never mentioned this part, did I? So in order to transfer the money to someone at our service desk, we need not only know the state that it's going to, but also the city in which the recipient is going to be picking it up. During my bereavement time off work, I took a quick flight down to Florida to clear my head, as I told my family. I took an even quicker drive into town in which the hag had sent money, and using a good old-fashioned phone book managed to find the exact address of the daughter's house. I don't know if your parents are still alive, I said, but I'm going to assume they croaked many years ago considering how old and miserable you are. Although I want you to know, if I had any information on them, they'd be my next targets for ever bringing a miserable creature like you into this world. Oh, and if you don't believe me about your daughter, here's a picture to prove it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small 6x4 piece of photo paper. It was a picture of her daughter, her husband, and their kids, all slashed at the throats, sitting on their living room couch, with big red smiles painted with blood on each of their faces. Her eyes widened so far that they could pop out. At last, the moment I had been waiting for, she started crying. She had stopped wriggling in her restraints and finally just given up, bawling a river of tears down her cheeks. I have never seen her so powerless. Usually at the store, she had a look of pure smug and superiority. Now, I had reduced her to a sobbing puddle of tied up skin and bones. It was wonderful. I've never felt so alive, but I kept my cool, and I did to her exactly what she did to me. I furiously stomped my foot as hard as I could, and I shouted, excuse me, I'm still waiting here. What the hell is your problem? I've got a lot to do tonight. It was over. I had completely broke her. She had learned her lesson, and I finally knew that I had proven my point. I removed the sock from her mouth and gave her a chance to speak. If you had anything to say to me, now's the time to say it, I warned. She was crying so much she could barely breathe. With each sob she let out, I felt more and more relief and more sure that what I had done had worked. Sure, it was a shame that it had to come to this, but she brought me to this. You're a monster, she cried, humiliated and defeated. I laughed hysterically. Well, then what does that make you? I asked, but before she could vocally spit out one more word, I grabbed the end of the razor wire, wrapped it around her neck, and pulled them in the opposite direction, severing her head from her shoulders. I then untied her, took the rope, the chair, the razor wire, the bat, and the bucket and left her house before the sun came up. Over the next few days, a report of a decapitated woman and her daughter's slaughtered family dominated the news. Nobody could figure out a motive or a reason why anybody would ever do this to an elderly woman and her beloved family. There were no prints found at the scene, no murder weapon found, and no incriminating evidence whatsoever recovered. As for me, well, here's something for you to think about. I'm still out there somewhere. Like I said, I'm not a bad person. If I was, why would I be telling you all of this? I want you to hear this and let it serve as a warning. Be careful how you treat others. No matter who they are, no matter where you meet them, you never know who you might push over the edge, and you never know what it might cost you.